Okay, as you know, we are reading, or maybe you don't know, we're reading from Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. We are on chapter 3 still. Um, if you are watching me right now live on Kick, of course, you can get a link that's in chat right now. If you're watching me on YouTube, come join me on Kick sometime. I'm on Kick, the link's in the description below. I stream every single weekday. So, we're probably a little more than halfway through chapter 3 right now. And we are on a concentrationary universe full of contradictions. As with the Terror, the concentrationary universe produced by it does not present a linear trend and a homogeneous picture. Far from being a static system, it continued to spin like a spinning top, and in any case went through cycles of relative cruelty and relative humanity. This is the opinion of the American historian, who not only paints in the gloomiest way the process that began in October 1917, but also mocks the Western statesmen who allowed themselves to be taken in by and come to hold respect for a mass murderer due to his shrewdness. A book by a Russian historian who is also committed to demonstrating the equivalence of the Stalinist USSR and the Third Reich, argues in a similar way. And yet, the two monographs, to which I mainly refer when analyzing Soviet Russia's concentrationary universe, tell a story quite different from the intentions of their authors. Indeed, the picture traced by the American historian could at times be mistaken for a product of Soviet propaganda, if it did not come from a fierce anti-communist. Let us begin by examining it. In 1921, as the Civil War rages, this is how the Moscow prison in Butyrka functions for some time. Quote, prisoners were allowed to leave the prison freely. They organized morning gymnastics sessions, established an orchestra and a choir, created a club, stocked with foreign magazines, and a good library. According to pre-revolutionary era tradition, upon liberation, each prisoner left his books behind. A council of prisoners assigned cells, some of which were well furnished, with carpets on the floors and walls. Another prisoner recalled, "We walked along the corridors as if they were avenues." Unquote. To Babina, a socialist revolutionary, life in prison seemed unreal. Will they ever succeed in locking us up? Unquote. Another socialist revolutionary, arrested in 1924 and sent to Sarajevo, is happily surprised to find herself in a place, quote, not at all like a prison. Not only could her political contacts provide the prisoners with plenty of food and clothing, but she was also able to transform her cell into the women's section of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Still, a few years later, in the Solovetsky archipelago, we see the prisoners, many of whom were scientists from St. Petersburg, have a theater, a library of 30,000 volumes, as well as a botanical garden, set up also a museum of local flora, fauna, art, and history. And the inmates produced monthly magazines and newspapers featuring satirical cartoons, extremely homesick poetry, and surprisingly frank fiction. That's all of that. All of this is from Anne Applebaum, by the way. It is true that the picture that the prison system presents over the same period of time is not homogeneous, and yet the above are not isolated cases. On the other hand, even if they were to be happy and fleeting islands, their existence would in itself be significant. Of course, there is no shortage of protests, but it is interesting to read the partially fulfilled demands made through a hunger strike by political prisoners, mostly Trotskyists. This is going to be from Klinovik. This is a political prisoner Trotskyist. Expand the library, replenish it with periodicals printed in the USSR and, at least, publications by the Communist International. Systematically update the economic, political, and literature sections, and supply literature in the language of national minorities. Subscribe to at least one copy of each foreign newspaper. Allow the ordering of materials for courses by correspondence. Set up special cultural fund for this purpose. Such funds exist even in prisons for criminals. Allow delivery to the prison of all foreign editions permitted in the USSR, in particular foreign newspapers, including bourgeois newspapers. Allow book exchanges. Provide writing paper in the amount of no less than 10 notebooks per person each month. Unquote. This is June 1931, and the date is significant. Despite involving a massive expansion of the concentration era universe, Stalin's coming to power, and the campaign he launched for the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, did not radically alter the existing situation within that universe. This is not only true for political prisoners. In the early 1930s, prisoners were relatively well off and free. Unquote. The Gulag leadership showed a certain religious tolerance and accommodated the request for a vegetarian diet made by members of certain religious sects. Here now is a glimpse of the penal colonies in the far north in the early 1930s. And this is again from that noted communist historian Anne Applebaum. Quote, needing hospitals, camp administrators built them and introduced systems for training prisoner pharmacists and prisoner nurses. Needing food, they constructed their own collective farms, their own warehouses, their own distribution systems. Needing electricity, they built power plants. Needing building materials, they built brick factories. Needing educated workers, they trained the ones that they had. Much of the ex-Kulak workforce turned out to be illiterate or semi-literate, which caused enormous problems when dealing with projects of relative technical sophistication. The camp's administration therefore set up technical training schools which required in turn more new buildings and new cadres. Math and physics teachers as well as political instructors to oversee their work. By the 1940s, Vorkuta, a city built in the permafrost, where roads had to be resurfaced and pipes had to be repaired every year, had acquired a geological institute and a university, theaters, puppet theaters, swimming pools, and nurseries. Again, Anne Applebaum, that noted communist historian, or rather anti-communist historian, I should say. Strange as it may be, the Gulag was slowly bringing civilization, if that is what it can be called, to the remote wilderness. Among the managers and administrators, there is no shortage of people who demonstrate humanity and intelligence. Quote, Berzin seems to have very much approved of, or at least enthusiastically paid lip service to, Gorky's ideas about prison reform. Glowing with paternalistic goodwill, Berzin provided his inmates with film theaters and discussion clubs, libraries, and restaurant-style dining halls. He planted gardens, complete with fountains and a small zoological park. He paid prisoners regular salaries and operated the same policy of early release for good work as did the commanders of the White Sea Canal. Unquote. '87. This is all Anne Applebaum right now. A bunch of this is Anne Applebaum until I tell you different. On the other hand, provoked by famine, by the pressure to increase the productivity of the prisoners, and through disorganization, and often by the incompetence or rapacity of the local managers, tragedies were plentiful. Particularly atrocities, as particularly atrocious, was the tragedy that befell 1933 deportees, who were supposed to cultivate the island of Nazino, western Siberia. It was a task which immediately turned out to be desperate. Without tools, with medicines, and food which had largely disappeared during the journey, on a completely virgin island, lacking buildings of any kind and food supplies, the deportees tried to survive by eating corpses or committing acts of real cannibalism. These details can be deduced from a letter sent by a local communist leader to Stalin, and then communicated to all members of the Politburo, who were in some ways shocked. Quote, the Nazino tragedy received broad publicity and became a subject of investigations by many commissions. And that is by Klevnuek again. Clearly it was not murderous intent that caused the horror. We are in the presence of one notable example of how badly things could go wrong through simple lack of planning. At least until 1937, in the Gulag, many unnecessary deaths were a consequence of disorganization. What characterizes the Soviet concentration era universe is primarily the obsession with development. And this obsession, while it causes Nazino's infamy, has quite different consequences. As in society as a whole, an attempt is made to stimulate socialist emulation. Among the inmates, those who distinguish themselves can enjoy a food supplement and other privileges. And that is not all. Quote, eventually top performers were also released early. For every 3 days of work, at 100% norm fulfillment, each prisoner received a day off his sentence. When the White Sea Canal was finally completed on time in August 1933, 12,484 prisoners were freed. Numerous others received medals and awards. One prisoner celebrated his early release at a ceremony complete with the traditional Russian presentation of bread and salt, as onlookers shouted, "Hooray for the builders of the canal!" In the heat of the moment, he began kissing an unknown woman. Together they wound up spending the night on the banks of the canal. Unquote. The productive obsession is intertwined with a pedagogical one, as demonstrated by the presence in the camps of an educational and cultural section, KVC, an institution in which the Moscow leaders of the Gulag actually believed a great deal. Precisely because of this, they took the wall newspapers exceedingly seriously. Well, if we try to read them, we see that the biographies of the rehabilitated inmates are written in language strikingly reminiscent of what could be heard from accomplished workers outside the colony. They were laboring, studying, making sacrifices, and trying to better themselves. Unquote. We're going to hear this term Stakhnovite again, which means model Soviet workers. The aim is to re-educate inmates, turning them into Stakhnovites, model Soviet workers, ready to participate with patriotic enthusiasm in the development of the country. Let's hear again from the American historian of the Gulag. Quote, as in the outside world, the camps also continued to hold socialist competitions. Work contests in which prisoners were meant to compete against one another, the better to raise output. They also honored the camp shock workers for their alleged ability to triple and quadruple the norms. Unquote. It is no accident that, until 1937, when addressing prisoners, the guards called them comrade. Imprisonment in the concentration camp did not exclude the possibility of social promotion. Many exiles also wound up working as guards or administrators in the camps. Above all, as we have seen, not a few learned a profession to be exercised from the moment of their release. Certainly, a brutal turn took place in 1937 as the Third Civil War flared up, and increasingly threatening clouds gathered on the international horizon. A real or imagined fifth column became the object of an increasingly obsessive hunt. In such circumstances, the detainee was no longer a potential comrade. It was then forbidden to address him in this way. He was entitled to the qualification of citizen, but it was a citizen who was a potential enemy of the people. From that moment on, was the Soviet concentration camp animated by a murderous will? So believes the American scholar repeatedly quoted here. But once again, disproving her is her own account. Go figure. In the 1940s, theoretically, the KFZ, educational cultural section of each camp, had at least one instructor, a small library, and a club where plays and concerts were staged, political lectures were organized, and debates were held. Unquote. There is more. As Hitler's war of annihilation raged on, and the entire country found itself in the absolute tragic situation, time and money are generously invested in strengthening and improving propaganda posters and the political indoctrination meetings of the detainees. Quote, within the records of the Gulag administration alone, there are hundreds and hundreds of documents testifying to the intensive work of the Cultural Educational Department. In the first quarter of 1943, for example, at the height of the war, frantic telegrams were sent back and forth from the camps to Moscow as camp commanders desperately tried to procure musical instruments for their prisoners. Meanwhile, the camps held a contest on the theme: the Great Motherland War of the Soviet people against the German fascist occupiers. 50 camp painters and 8 sculptors participated. Unquote. This is all Anne Applebaum. In that same year, the head of the camp with 13,000 inmates drew up a significant balance sheet of his activities. Quote, again, Anne Applebaum. He notes grandly that in the second half of that year, 762 political speeches were given, attended by 70,000 prisoners. Presumably, many attended more than once. At the same time, the KFZ held 444 political information sessions, attended by 82,400 prisoners. It printed 5,046 wall newspapers, read by 350,000 people. It put on 232 concerts and plays, showed 69 films, and organized 38 theatrical groups. Certainly, since Hitler's invasion, the prisoners had dramatically felt the effects of shortages. But this had nothing to do with a murderous intent. Quote, the high mortality rates in certain years in the concentration camp partly reflected the events taking place outside. In the winter of 1941-42, when a quarter of the Gulag population died of starvation, perhaps 1 million inhabitants of Leningrad, trapped by the German blockade, starved to death. And shortages and malnutrition raged in parts of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, even in such a desperate situation, in January 1943, the Soviet government established a special food fund for the Gulag. And still, the food situation did improve, as the tide of the war turned in the Soviet Union's favor. We are so far from a burgeoning murderous will that the climate of national unity aroused by the Great Patriotic War was also felt inside the Gulag. At the same time, the Gulag underwent a massive thinning out as a result of a series of amnesties. Above all, we see the former inmates fighting valiantly, making a career in the Red Army, being admitted to the Communist Party, and winning honors and medals for military valor. All the while expressing satisfaction and pride at the fact that they had at their disposal technologically advanced weapons, produced, quote, thanks to the industrialization of our country, which itself had meant the first substantial expansion of the concentration-area universe. With its altering of relatively well-off and free phases, and phases of sharp deterioration in the economic and legal condition of the inmates, the history of the Gulag mirrors the history of Soviet society. With the attempts to bring about in the country as a whole Soviet democracy, socialist democratization, and even a socialism without the dictatorship of the proletariat, paralleled the attempts to re-establish socialist legality, or revolutionary legality, in the Gulag. It is for this reason that bitter denunciations of the Soviet concentration-area universe came from within and from its leadership. In 1930, it was Yagoda who called for action on the whole prison itself, which is rotten to the core. In February 1938, it was Vyshinsky himself, the Prosecutor General of the USSR, who denounced the unsatisfactory and in some cases absolutely intolerable conditions of detention, which reduce men to wild beasts, unquote. A few months later, it was Levitny Beria, head of the secret police under Stalin, who endorsed a stance of calling for the investigators, who treated beatings as a main method of investigation, and who maimed prisoners in the absence of sufficient proof of their anti-Soviet activity have to be strictly punished. These were not ritual denunciations. When discovered, those responsible for the abuses were severely punished, even by death. Many others were dismissed. There was no shortage of conflict between the judiciary and the repressive apparatus, which resisted the introduction of rules that appeared to be an extremely unpleasant intrusion. In order to strengthen control, the submission of complaints and petitions by prisoners was encouraged. At other times, an attempt was made to improve the situation by means of amnesties and the decongestion of the camps. In the interval between one denunciation and another, there was real improvement. These were the phases of liberalism, quote unquote, soon overwhelmed by the onset of new crises. Because of the interweaving of objective circumstances and subjective responsibilities, like society as a whole, the Gulag failed to overcome the state of exception. Tsarist Siberia, Liberal England Siberia, and the Soviet Gulag. Should we compare, or even liken the Soviet Gulag to the Nazi concentration camps? It is a question that could be answered with another. Why limit the comparison only to these two realities? In Tsarist Russia, conquest pontificates, following Solzhenitsyn. The concentration-area universe was less crowded and less ruthless than in the times of Lenin and, above all, Stalin. It is worth recalling what Anton Chekhov wrote in 1890. Quote, "We have allowed millions of people to rot in prisons, to rot for no purpose, without any consideration, and in a barbarous manner. We have driven people tens of thousands of versts through the cold, in shackles, infected them with syphilis, perverted them, multiplied the number of criminals. But none of this has anything to do with us. It's just not interesting." Unquote. In the course of its centuries-long duration, the Tsarist concentration-area universe, which starting at least with Peter the Great, and like the Gulag, also aimed at procuring the forced labor necessary to develop the most inaccessible and least developed regions, has long presented traits of extreme cruelty. A via dolorsura way of suffering led the condemned to exile or to forced labor in Siberia. Quote, "Besides being flogged with the knout, many of them suffered the mutilation of a hand, ear, foot, nose, as well as the humiliation of being branded." Unquote. In the 19th century, there were attempts to eliminate the most extreme forms of cruelty, but these were partial measures that were not always successful. From all of this, it emerges how fragile is the attempt to play down Tsarist Siberia's repressive apparatus in order to isolate the Soviet Gulag and equate it with Nazi Konzentrationslager. But a further consideration is more important. It is methodologically incorrect to compare a condition of normality and an acute state of exception. Read with greater critical awareness, and the comparison established by Conquest may have a result opposite to the one he proclaims. It is only in pre-revolutionary Russia that administrative detention and deportation is considered a normal practice, even in the absence of conflict and particular dangers. In Soviet Russia, on the other hand, the state of exception powerfully influences the genesis and the configuration of the concentration area universe, which becomes all the more brutal the further one moves away from the condition of normality. It is now necessary to take a further step forward. Beyond Russia, Tsarist and Soviet, and Germany, it is necessary to bring another countries into the comparison. A dual function is also inherent in the concentration area universe utilized by liberal England. With regard to the Irish dissidents, it has been observed that between the 18th and 19th centuries, they had their official Siberia. In Australia, which at least until 1868 swallowed up representatives of nearly every English protest movement. So much for repression. But one must not lose sight of the economic function of the Siberia of liberal England. Immediately after the Glorious Revolution, there was a massive increase in crimes carrying the death penalty. Even those responsible for theft of a shilling or handkerchief, or for the unauthorized cutting of an ornamental brush, are punished. And not even 11-year-old boys are spared. This terrorist legislation, which with some mitigations continued into the 19th century, provided for an alternative. Those who received a pardon were subjected to penal servitude, which forced them to work for a certain number of years in colonies that were still little exploited and explored, first in North America and later in Australia. In other words, even economically, Australia in particular constituted the Siberia of liberal England. Its functions diminished as the work of first the black slaves and then the Indian and Chinese coolies and other colonial peoples intervened. English Siberia is no less cruel than Tsarist Siberia. On the contrary, of this totalitarian society, which developed in Australia at the same time the extermination of the Aborigines is carried out, a picture has been traced that also draws on memoirs and is particularly chilling. Quote, at unpredictable times, the convicts would be mustered, counted, and given full body searches with inspections of the mouths and anus. The provisions were brought out to the various gangs in wooden or large tin dishes and set down as before a hog or a dog, and they had to gnaw at it just the same. The basis of prison discipline was the informer. Not to inform became suspicious in itself. And hardly a week passed without the disclosure of elaborate plots, complete with lists of names. Indulgence was not only got by such traffic in human blood. The quality of the information mattered far less than its quantity. Informers had their quotas and denunciations to fill, and were capable of any act of perfidy or blood, no matter how black or horrifying such a deed might be. In this way, the normal relations between guilt and punishment mutated into the continuous sadistic fiction, whose sole aim was to preserve terror. Authority was absolute and capricious. The 200 flogs were spaced over many days. The flagellators were almost as much besmeared with blood as even we. The decisive way out of this misery was suicide. Unquote. And in fact, suicide was not only widespread, but was a practice that often involved the entire community of prisoners. A group of convicts would choose two men by drawing straws, one to die, the other to kill him. Others would stand by as witness. In this way, for the few days of the journey and the trial, which took place in Sydney, at a certain distance from Siberia proper, before going to the gallows, the murderer could enjoy the conditions of a normal prisoner. His was actually an indirect and deferred suicide. And this pause allowed the witnesses to breathe before returning to hell and eventually proceeding to a new draw. The concentration-era universe in Soviet Russia and the Third Reich. On the other hand, in the course of the Second World War, the concentration camp also came into explicit focus in the liberal West. Across the Atlantic, Franklin D. Roosevelt has American citizens of Japanese descent, including women and children, interned in concentration camps. Yet, the United States is in a far more favorable geopolitical situation than the Soviet Union. In any case, after the Battle of Midway, one can no longer convincingly speak of military and security problems. Nevertheless, Americans of Japanese ancestry continued to be incarcerated in concentration camps. Beginning gradually, access to freedom was achieved only in mid-1946, almost a year after the end of the war. Even slower was the return home of the Latin American citizens of Japanese origin, deported from 13 Latin American countries to the USA. Only in 1948 were the last ones released from the internment camp, or concentration camp of Crystal City in Texas. Well, it would be hasty, to say the least, to explain this affair by stating not from the war and the state of exception, but from the ideology of a president accused of totalitarianism by his adversaries because of his economic interventionism during the Great Depression, and also because of the constitutional nonchalance with which he dragged a very reluctant country into the war. With this consideration, we come upon another omission found in the usual historic comparisons, namely in the concentrationary universes that developed in the course of the 20th century in the liberal West, sometimes assuming horrific forms. The German exiles who, at the outbreak of war, were locked up in French concentration camps had the impression that their destiny was simply to die. The mistreatment of German prisoners by the United States after the war ended was decidedly revolting, as the Canadian historian James Bach has documented in his time, and which was eventually, albeit reluctantly and with some reservations, accepted by the attorneys general of Dwight D. Eisenhower. More recent studies have brought to light other details. I will just mention one of them. A U.S. commission at the time ascertained that, out of 139 prisoners examined, 137 had testicles permanently destroyed as a result of blows they had received. We will also see the horror of the concentration camp in which, at the outbreak of the Cold War, the British locked up those suspected of communism. Thank you so much for the follow. There is no Australia. Fantastic name. Finally, we should remember the Gulag, in which, from 1948 and following the break with the USSR, the communists loyal to Stalin were imprisoned in Yugoslavia. At least in this case, the Stalinists were not the creators, but the victims of the concentration camp. Installed by a country that was certainly communist at the time, but an ally of the West. Even if one wants to start from the assumption of the particular magnitude and severity of the Soviet Gulag, the main problem remains open. It is still necessary to distinguish the role of ideology from the role of objective conditions, the exceptional gravity of the danger, and the widespread shortages that characterize the USSR. In comparison, it is much simpler to reflexively deduce everything to ideology, and thereby equate the concentrationary universes created by both totalitarian, quote-unquote, ideologies, rather than engaging in a more complex analysis. But let us focus anyway on Soviet Russia and the Third Reich. In the first case of the concentrationary universe emerges while the second time of troubles continues to rage. Still in the 1930s, the state did not exercise full control of the territory. Quote, the crime rate in a country going through a sweeping social transformation, combined with the destruction of its traditional social structures, was very high indeed. Unquote. The situation of the Far East regions were decidedly more serious, presenting themselves as follows. Quote, they were insecure areas, poorly controlled by the authorities, where marginal elements and outlaws were concentrated, where armed gangs attacked isolated kolkhozs and killed the few representatives of the Soviet government, where everyone was armed, where human life had scarcely any value, and where humans rather than animals were sometimes hunted. These were areas where the state, in the sense defined by Max Weber, a system that successfully claims the right to rule a territory by virtue of use of legitimate physical violence, was virtually absent. Unquote. From the assassination on the German ambassador in Moscow, carried out in July 1918, during the session of the Fifth Pan-Russian Congress of Soviets, by the member of a party, the socialist revolutionaries, that was part of the government, at least up to the assassination of Kirov in front of his office door and at the hands of a young communist. Soviet power was grappling with terrorism, a phenomenon with a long history in Russia, and feared infiltration at every level of the state apparatus. By an opposition determined to overthrow the power of the usurpers and traitors, quote unquote. That is to say, only with the advent of autocracy did Soviet power achieve full control of the territory and the state apparatus, and terror was primarily a response to a very acute and long-lasting crisis. Even afterwards, the situation continued to be characterized by an interweaving of contradictions. The thickening storm of war at the international level, the latent civil war at the domestic level, the industrialization in 4 stages, which was considered necessary for the salvation of the country, but which at the same time provoked new conflicts and new tensions, which prolonged the state of exception in new forms. Precisely for this reason, as a recent study points out, the terror cannot be construed solely as a series of orders issued by Stalin and his accomplices. In reality, popular elements also played a part, and there was no lack of initiative from below. Often, it was the workers, animated by a zealous faith, pointed out above, who demanded the death sentence for traitors, and even the renunciation of legal subtleties, of long and costly judicial proceedings. And all this took place in the course of a process of limited but still real democratization, with the development of popular participation in the management of power in the workplace, with the substitution of the secret vote for an open vote, and with the possibility of choosing in the election of unions and factory leaders from among several candidates, and that newly elected often made concrete commitments to improving working conditions and reducing accidents at work. Yes, there was no contradiction between repression and democracy in the political psychology of Stalin and his followers, unquote. And in this sense, one can even speak of a democratization of repression. But it was precisely this democratization that stimulated an expansion of repression. Taking advantage of the new possibility of questioning corrupt and inefficient officials in the factory and in letters of the press, the tumultuous movement from below that thus developed tended to portray them as enemies of the people, and to brand constant accidents at work as a form of sabotage of the new society it was engaged in building. The feeling of the growing threat of war and the obsessive hunt for the widespread but very well concealed fifth column. The rampant fear and hysteria turned factory trade union and party assemblies into a free-for-all. At times, it was Stalin and his closest collaborators who saw themselves forced to intervene to contain and channel this fury, warning against the tendency to dig up traitors and saboteurs everywhere, and thus to destroy the party and trade union organizations. This brings to mind the Great Fear, which raged in France, 1798, in the weeks and months immediately following the storming of the Bastille, when, blowing out of all proportion a danger which was not illusory, peasant imagination and rumor saw destructive brigands, and the mercenaries of the enemies of the people, and of that aristocratic conspiracy with another face, foreign invasion. Unquote. In the USSR of the second half of the 1930s, the danger was real and of extreme gravity, but no less real was the hysteria. In conclusion, in Soviet Russia, terror emerged in the period of time from the First World War, which opened the Second Time of Troubles, and the Second World War, which threatened to inflict upon the country and the nation as a whole an even more colossal catastrophe. The destruction and enslavement explicitly enunciated in Mein Kampf, and the terror emerged in the course of a forced industrialization campaign that aimed to save country and nation, and in the course of which the horror of ferocious repression on a large scale was interwoven with real processes of emancipation. The massive spread of education and culture, prodigious vertical mobility, the emergence of the welfare state, the tumultuous and contradictory protagonism of social classes, hitherto condemned to total subalternity. The differences with the Third Reich are clear, which, since its advent, could count on the full control of territory and state apparatus, and on the traditional efficiency of the auxiliary bureaucratic network. If in Russia ideology played a secondary role in the creation of the state of exception, which existed before October 1917 and was, if anything, prolonged by revolutionary messianism, partially opposed by Stalin. In Germany, the state of exception and the associated concentrationary universe were from the outset the result of a clearly defined political project and a clearly defined ideological vision. Hitler came to power with an explicit program of war and territorial expansion. In order to avoid the collapse of the home front, as had occurred during the First World War, he was determined to use the most ruthless terror. The expansionism of Nazi Germany also aimed to reassert white and Arab supremacy on a global scale, and to take up and radicalize the colonial tradition, enforcing it in Eastern Europe itself. From the outset, the Konzentrationslager targeted possible opponents to the war, and to the colonial and racial empire that Hitler intended to conquer and build. A prerequisite for the success of this program was the neutralization of the Jewish Bolshevik virus that sowed subversion and undermined the foundations of civilization, questioning the natural hierarchy of peoples and races. It was therefore necessary to liquidate the Jews, the communist commissars, and the political cadres in the territories to be conquered, as well as in Germany itself. The way was thus cleared for treating the inferior races of Eastern Europe as the indigenous people of the Americas had been, annihilated in order to make way for Germanic colonists, and to be used as slaves in the service of the white Aryan master race. Gulag, Konzentrationslager, and the Absent Third. Beginning with the invasion first of Poland and then of the USSR, the Nazi concentrationary universe seemed to repeat and further aggravate the most tragic chapters in the history of colonial slavery. At a time when, due to the rapacity of the Atlantic slave trade, the availability of slaves seemed almost unlimited, the owners had no economic interest in sparing them. They could easily condemn them to die of overwork in order to replace them with others, and to extract from each of them the maximum possible advantage. It is thus that, observed a 19th century economist to whom Marx drew attention, the fertile agriculture of the West Indies, quote, has engulfed millions of the African race. Yes. Negro life is most recklessly sacrificed. Unquote. The war unleashed by Hitler in Eastern Europe represents a new and even more brutal form of the slave trade. Captured and plundered en masse, the Slavic Untermachen, Those who had survived the Germanization of the territory were forced to die of overwork in order to make possible the civilization of the master race and to feed their war machine. They suffered a condition similar to that of African slaves of the Caribbean, to whom they were explicitly compared by the Führer. The prison systems reproduce the social relations that give rise to them. In the USSR, inside and outside the Gulag, we basically see the work a development dictatorship that tried to mobilize and re educate all the forces in order to overcome an age old backwardness, made all the more urgent by the approach of a war that, according to the explicit declaration of Mein Kampf, was to be one of enslavement and annihilation. In this framework, terror was intertwined with the emancipation of oppressed nationalities, as well as with a strong social mobility, and with access to education, culture, and even to positions of responsibility and management for social strata, which, up to that moment, had been completely marginalized. The frenzied productivism and pedagogy and the associated social mobility were felt, for better or worse, even within the Gulag. The Nazi concentration area universe, on the other hand, reflected the racially based hierarchy that characterized the already existing racial state and the racial empire to be built. In this case, the concrete behavior of individual prisoners played an irrelevant or very marginal role, and therefore the pedagogical concern would have been meaningless. In conclusion, the detainee in the Gulag was a potential comrade, forced to participate in particularly harsh conditions in the productive effort of the entire country. And after 1937, he or she was in any case a potential citizen. Even if the line of demarcation from the enemy of the people or the member of the fifth column, which the total war on the horizon or already in progress required to neutralize, had become thin. The detainee in the Nazi lager was primarily Untermachen, marked forever by his or her racial designation or degeneration. If one really wants to find an analogy to the concentration saga, it is necessary to bring in the concentrationary universe that runs deep through the colonial tradition, where Hitler explicitly intended to place himself, and that targeted colonized or colonized descendant people. Here is the central omission of typical comparisons. In this sense, we might speak of the absent third of comparisons in vogue today. Two distinguished historians have respectively defined the militarized labor camps of colonial India of 1877 and the concentration camps in which the Libyans were imprisoned by liberal Italy as extermination camps. Even if one were to consider this formulation emphatic, it is the racial logic and hierarchy that predominated in the Italian and Western colonial empires, as well as in the concentration camps built by them, which in any case more clearly resembled the concentrationary universe of the Third Reich. We are also led to think of Nazism when we read of the manner in which the Canadian Holocaust, or the final solution of our Indian problem, was perpetrated. The Truth and Commission into Genocide in Canada speaks of death camps, of men, women, and children being deliberately killed, of a system whose aim was to destroy most native people by disease, relocation, and outright murder. In order to achieve this result, the champions of white supremacy did not hesitate in hurting innocent children, who were put to death by beatings and torture, and after being deliberately exposed to tuberculosis and other diseases. Others would then undergo forced sterilization. A small collaborating minority would manage to survive, but only after renouncing their own language and identity and putting themselves at the service of the butchers. In this case, too, it can be assumed that righteous indignation has contributed to an overloaded characterization. The fact remains that we come across practices that are identical or similar to those in force in the Third Reich, and implemented on the basis of an ideology once again similar to that which presided over the construction of Hitler's racial state. Now, let us discuss the situation in the southern United States. After the Civil War, black prisoners, who made up the vast majority of the prison population, were often rented out to private companies, and were kept in great rolling cages that followed construction camps and railroad buildings. The same official report showed, quote, that convicts were excessively and sometimes cruelly punished, that they were poorly clothed and fed, that the sick were neglected, insomuch as no hospitals had been provided, that they were confined with the well convicts. A grand jury investigation at the penitentiary hospital in Mississippi reported that inmates were all bearing on their person the marks of the most inhumane and brutal treatments. Most of them have their backs cut in great wales, scars, and blisters, some with the skin peeling off in places as the result of severe beatings. They were lying there dying, some of them on bare boards, so poor and emaciated that their bones almost came through their skin. Many complaining for want of food. We actually saw live vermin crawling over their faces, and the little bedding and clothing they have is in tatters and stiff with filth. In mining camps in Arkansas and Alabama, convicts were worked through the winter without shoes, standing in water much of the time. In both states, the task system was used, whereby a squad of 3 was compelled to mine a certain amount of coal per day on penalty of severe flogging for the whole squad. Convicts in the turpentine camps in Florida, with stride chains and waist chains riveted on their bodies, were compelled to work at a trot. Unquote. We are in the presence of a system that makes use of chains, dogs, whips, and firearms, and which produces for the prisoners a living hell. The death rate was highly significant. Between 1877 and 1880, in the course of the construction of the railroad lines at Greenwood and Augusta, nearly 45% of the forced laborers employed there died. And these were young black men in their prime of their lives. Or another statistic could be quoted, relating to the same period. In the first 2 years that Alabama leased its prisoners, nearly 20% of them died. In the following year, mortality rose to 35%. In the fourth, nearly 45% were killed. In relation to the mortality rate, the systematic statistical comparison with concentration camps in the USSR and the Third Reich would be interesting. With regard to the Gulag, it has been calculated that at the beginning of the 1930s, before the crackdown provoked by the attack on Kirov and the growing dangers of war, the annual mortality rate corresponded more or less to 4.8% of the average camp population. Admittedly, this statistic does not include the Goldfields camp at the Colma River zone. One must take into account the characteristic underestimates in the reports of the health sections. And nevertheless, even if one were to raise the official figures significantly, it seems difficult to reach the mortality rate that raged on in African American prisoners just seen above. Moreover, the reasons for the underestimates are significant. The fact is that high rates of mortality and evasions could lead to severe penalties. Unquote. The health sections of the camps feared being accused of negligence and untimeliness in admitting the sick. Camps could be inspected at any time. Judging from the mortality rate of the semi-slaves rented out, it does not appear that a similar threat loomed over American entrepreneurs, who grew rich from building the Greenwood and Augusta Railroad lines, or from other enterprises. It is worth holding on to one essential point, however. In the U.S. South, black convicts suffered horrific living and working conditions, and died en masse during a period of peace. The state of exception played no role, and also any productivist concern played a marginal or entirely non-existent role. The concentrationary universe of the U.S. South produced the racial hierarchy and racial state that characterized that society as a whole. The black inmate was neither a potential comrade nor a potential citizen. He or she was an Untermachen. The treatment inflicted on him or her by whites was the treatment considered normal in dealing with races alien to authentic civilization. And so, again, we come across the ideology of the Third Reich. On the other hand, it is prominent US historians who have compared the prison system just seen to the prison camps of Nazi Germany. And it is no coincidence that medical experiments in the US were carried out by hiring African Americans as guinea pigs. As in Nazi Germany, such experimentations were conducted on Untermachen. On the other hand, in the years of Wilhelm II, colonialist and imperialist Germany conducted medical experiments in Africa and to the detriment of Africans, before conducting them on its own territory. In this activity, two doctors stand out, who later became the masters of Joseph Mengele. In Germany, the Nazis brought to completion the perversion of medicine and science that had already taken shape in the course of the European and American colonial traditions. Not only can the Third Reich not be separated from the history of the relationships established by the West with colonized peoples or their descendants, but it should be added that this tradition continued to show signs of vitality well after Hitler's defeat. In 1997, President Clinton felt compelled to apologize to the African American community. Quote, in the 1960s, over 400 black men from Alabama were used as human guinea pigs by the government. Sick with syphilis, they were not treated because the authorities wanted to study the effects of the disease on a sample population. Unquote. That's from ER 1997. See Washington 2007, page 184. The National Awakening in Eastern Europe. Two opposing responses. It is clear that the comparison of concentration camps, based on the omission of the treatment of inferior races, the National Awakening in Eastern Europe. Two opposing responses. It is clear that the comparison of concentration camps, based on the omission of the treatment of inferior races, quote unquote, by the liberal West, is absurd. As is the comparison on the basis of separating domestic from foreign policies, and the repressive practices from the ideologies on which they are based. If we bring into play these elements, and these usually ignored connections, The typical equivalence made between the two totalitarian dictators turns into an antithesis. It has been observed that Stalin was very impressed by the awakening of the nationalities oppressed or marginalized within the Habsburg Empire. In this regard, refer to his remarks made in 1921 during the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party. Quote, about 50 years ago, all Hungarian towns bore a German character. Now they have become Magyarized. The Czechs are also experiencing an awakening. It is a phenomenon that affected Europe as a whole. From the German city that it was, Riga has become a Latvian city. Similarly, the cities of Ukraine will inevitably be Ukrainianized, rendering the previously predominant Russian elements secondary. And how did Ukraine thank Russia? how did Ukraine thank the USSR? Yeah. Well, it's a little more complex than that. But if you read my book, Fundamentals of Revolutionary Party Building by Kim Jong-il, I think you will get a better idea of what a lot of those problems were. Which you can find, by the way, in the same playlist you might have found this one in, which is the live readings playlist. Look for that in the playlist section. Starting from the realization of this process, considered progressive and irreversible, the Bolshevik Party as a whole, and particularly Stalin, engaged in a novel and fascinating experiment in governing a multi-ethnic state, which can be described as follows. Quote, the Soviet Union was the world's first affirmative action empire. Russia's new revolutionary government was the first of the old European multi-ethnic states to confront the rising tide of nationalism and respond by systematically promoting the national consciousness of its ethnic minorities and establishing for them many of the characteristic institutional forms of the nation-state. The Bolshevik strategy was to assume leadership over what now appeared to be the inevitable process of decolonization and carry it out in a manner that would preserve the territorial integrity of the old Russian Empire. To that end, the Soviet state created not just a dozen large national republics, but tens of thousands of national territories scattered across an entire expanse of the Soviet Union. New national elites were trained and promoted to leadership positions in the government, schools, and industrial enterprises of these newly formed territories. In each territory, the national language was declared the official language of the government. In dozens of cases, this necessitated the creation of a writing language where one did not yet exist. The Soviet state financed the mass production of books, journals, newspapers, movies, operas, museums, folk music ensembles, and other cultural output in the non-Russian languages. Nothing comparable to it had ever been attempted before. That is from Martin, 2004, pages 1 and 2. The novelty of this policy is all the stronger if one compares it with the obsession with homogenization that was still raging in the United States and Canada at the height of the 20th century. Forced to sever ties with their community of origin and with their families, Indigenous children also had to renounce their dances and their quote-unquote strange clothing. They were obliged to wear their hair short, and above all to avoid using their tribal language like the plague. Breaking the rule that required the exclusive use of English resulted in harsh punishments, and in Canada, even electric shock therapy. As far as the USSR is concerned, there is one essential point on which there is now some consensus. Quote, the republics thus received sooner or later a flag, an anthem, a language, a national academy, in some cases even a foreign commissioner's office. And they retained the right, later used in 1991, to secede from the Federation, although the procedure was not specified. Unquote. Yeah, goddamn, you're right. This is a good example. The national question, the Soviet Union, gives an idea of how to apply to the United States. Yeah, in a way that I'm always talking about why the idea of like with U.S. annexation, the people who are friends on the left who think that they then have to fight as Canadian patriots to protect Canadian sovereignty are confused, and that revolution does not necessarily mean that we want to balkanize the US and balkanize Canada, and that even an annexation of Canada by the US could even present us with new opportunities. But what that needs to be based on, of course, is the new proletarian emergent consciousness that can only be made possible by the decolonization that will be going on at the same time. And that's what makes the ACP reactionary, is the fact that they want to hold on to this reactionary identity instead of creating a new proletarian identity for this land. They want to hold on to the United States as an ideology and even deny historical facts and truths. Good comment. Thanks, Godstam. To continue. In Mein Kampf, Hitler also took his cue from the Slavicization and erasure of the German element, Anderschlag, taking place in Eastern Europe. In his eyes, however, it is a process that is neither progressive nor irreversible, but only very radical measures can stop it and drive it back. It is not a question of conducting a policy of assimilation and of promoting a Germanization of the Slavic element in Austria. No. Germanization can be carried out only as regards human beings. Unquote. It would be ridiculous to want to make a Negro or Chinese a German just because he has learned German, is ready in the future to speak the German language, and give his vote to a German political party. Unquote. Such a Germanization is in reality a de-Germanization. It would stand for the beginning of a bastardization, and thus for an annihilation of the Germanic element. And precisely those qualities would be destroyed which had enabled the conquering race to achieve victory over the inferior people. Unquote. That's, of course, Hitler. Germanizing the land without ever Germanizing the people was only possible by following a very precise model. On the other side of the Atlantic, the white race had expanded westwards, Americanizing the land, certainly not the native population. In this way, the United States has remained a Nordic Germanic state, without degrading to an international mishmash of peoples. This same model was to be followed by Germany in Eastern Europe. If the Bolsheviks and Stalin were concerned to promote national elites and an indigenous political class in the Soviet republics that was as broad as possible, Hitler's program for the conquest of the East was exactly the opposite. Quote, all representatives of Polish intellectuality must be annihilated. It was necessary by any means to prevent the formation of a new intellectual class. Unquote. Only in this way could the colonial task be fulfilled. The peoples destined to work like slaves in the service of the master race were not to lose sight of the fact that there can be only one master, the German. Speaking in 1921, at the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, Stalin drew attention to the further element in the turning point that was taking place in world history. Quote, in the course of the imperialist war, The imperialist group of the belligerent powers themselves were forced to appeal to the colonies, from which they drew the human material to build up their troops. And this could not fail to arouse in these people an inclination to freedom and struggle. The national awakening in Eastern Europe was in tune with the one taking place in the colonial world. Quote, the development of the national question into the general colonial question was not a historical accident. Unquote. Stalin. From Stalin's work 1952 to 56. Very interesting quote to bring up. Now, if you go back and look at my reading that we did of Gerald Horne, you'll find that he is also talking about this very similar thing taking place in the mainland, in the United States and Canada, because of the British Empire arming, formal groups that it was enslaving, and thus leading them to starting to question whether they should end the slave trade or not because of exactly that result. Which then, of course, we know leads to the counter-revolution of 1776. If you'd like to learn about that, check out my live reading for that. If national awakening in Europe commanded it to put an end to a policy of discrimination, denationalization, and oppression to the detriment of minorities, and the colonies, the national awakening was destined to radically challenge the concentration-era universe, inflicted by the conquerors on the races they considered inferior. The novelty of the use of colonial troops did not escape Hitler, who had hastened to denounce the treason thus consummated against the white race. France was especially guilty of this, where a process of bastardization was quickly and ruinously put into practice, and where one even witnessed the creation of an African state on European soil, quote unquote. Any of this sounding familiar to rhetoric you hear today still? We're not dealing here only with prejudices. We are in the presence of a precise political program, which looked with horror at the use of colonial troops and at racial mixing, even on the level of sexual and marriage relations. Because these practices, by breaking down the barrier between the race of masters and the race of servants, undermined the domination and concentration-era universe which the former was called upon to impose upon the latter, in the superior interests of civilization. From the Nazi leaders' point of view, the national awakening in Eastern Europe and the use of colonial troops in the internal colonies of the West, with the associated emboldening of the colonial peoples, constituted a terrible overall threat to civilization and to the white race. The development of the racial state and empire, and the unleashing of the war in the East, with the influx into the Nazi concentration-era universe of mass of slaves recruited from the inferior races and destined to work and die in the service of the master race, also represented a response to this threat. The Nazi concentration-era universe was programmed to devour millions and millions of slaves or superfluous human beings, an inevitable result of a program that aimed at the rapid Germanization of the land, while a priori excluding the Germanization of the indigenous people who inhabited it. And such a project would have devoured an even more immense mass of victims had it not been countered by an opposing project based on the recognition of not only an existential but also the cultural and national rights of indigenous peoples. And that's why we defend the USSR, by the way. Through a series of both objective circumstances and subjective responsibilities, which in no way should be dismissed, the second project also produced a concentration-era universe. But despite its horrors, it can in no way be equated to the first, which explicitly presuppose the continuation of genocidal practices already in place in the colonial world proper, and their extension in an even more brutal form to the new colonies to be built in Eastern Europe. Totalitarianism or developmentalist dictatorship is the title of this next section. We are now in a position to understand the inadequate or misleading character of the category of totalitarianism, generally invoked to consecrate the equating of Stalin's USSR and Hitler's Germany. A growing number of historians are questioning or rejecting it outright. In order to explain the history of the Soviet Union, some of them start from Peter the Great, and proceeding even further backwards from encircled Muscovy, with a very fragile geopolitical position, as the invasion of Genghis Khan had shown. From history and geography, Stalin therefore felt called upon to promote the fastest possible economic development, in order to save both the nation and the new socio-political order that the nation had given itself. It was thus that a developmentalist dictatorship emerged and imposed itself. All this within a society which, on the one hand, was presumably not entirely unmindful of Lenin's 1905 warning, quote, "Whoever wants to reach socialism by a different road, other than that of political democracy, will inevitably arrive at conclusions that are absurd and reactionary both in the economic and the political sense," unquote. And on the other hand, due to both objective circumstances and inherent ideological weaknesses, was dragged from one state of exception to another, from one civil war to another. We are thus in the presence of a society characterized not by uniformity and totalitarian alignment, but by the permanence and omnipotent presence of civil war, which manifested itself even within families, torn apart as a result of opposing attitudes of its members towards, for example, the process of the collectivization of the countryside. Quote, "A peasant woman who belonged to an evangelical sect and strongly opposed collectivization murdered her activist husband with an axe while he slept, allegedly because he was a call-outs activist." Unquote. Similar horrific acts of bloodshed also sometimes came to stain the relationship between parents, sons, and daughters. The conflict took on the ferocity of religious war, and this applied not only to those who explicitly referred to motives derived from Christianity, but also to the fervent followers of the new society, themselves animated by zealous faith. Especially enlightening is the analysis of the reports on production. Let us try to imagine ourselves in a Soviet factory, or in one of the many construction sites that came into being in the wake of the gigantic modernization program promoted by Stalin. In the meantime, far from being uniformly decided from above, their location came at the end of a complex decision-making process, made up of impassioned and often fiery discussions. Contrary to the strict centralization of the Tsarist era, the anti-colonialist rhetoric of the Soviet Union gave regional lobbies a power unthinkable under the ancient regime. These regions were revealed to be particularly strong in that, precisely by virtue of their backwardness, they called upon the regime to fulfill its promises to do away with the inequalities and injustices of Tsarist imperialism, in order to promote industrialization and modernization on a national scale. Once we enter the place of production and work, we see that there was no strict discipline and blind obedience. On the contrary, there was no shortage of disorder and bitter conflict. In the meantime, we see the strong fluctuations of the labor force. Stalin was forced to fight tenaciously against this phenomenon, And yet, still, in 1936, quote, more than 87% of industrial workers leave their jobs, unquote. Stimulated also by the policy of full employment and the concrete possibilities of social ascendancy. This fluctuation nevertheless constituted a counterweight to the power exercised by authority in the factory or in the building site. But that is not all. On the whole, we are witnessing a kind of tug of war with three participants: the party and trade union leaders, committed to increasing labor productivity; the workers, often concentrating primarily with raising wage levels; and technicians, caught in the middle and uncertain of what to do. Mostly, it was the workers who had the upper hand, and often even the technicians disregarded orders from Moscow. It should be added that it was the working class itself that was divided. While it aroused the enthusiasm of some, the calls to increase productivity and to engage fully in socialist competition in order to develop the productive forces and catch up with or surpass the more advanced countries of the West provoked discontent, quiet resistance, or open hostility in others. If the ideologues were branded by the former discontents as the forces of the Antichrist, in return the former harbored a holy hatred for the enemies of a new socialist life, in language that leads us back once again to the zealous faith that inspired an entire generation. That which ultimately pitted followers and opponents of the new order against each other was certainly not the only conflict. We also see confrontation between technical cadres on the one hand and the mass of workers on the other. The former had often fought against the Bolsheviks and on the side of the whites. Appeal was therefore made to their competence, but at the same time an attempt was made to subject them to some form of control. But even the newly educated technicians and specialists, or those who, although trained under the old regime, also from patriotic sentiments collaborated loyally with the Soviet power, nevertheless had to face the challenge coming from a new social stratum, the vanguard workers. And this side was all the more fearsome in a society in which workers are called upon to judge their leaders. It was well understood that when the engineers often strongly resisted workers' control. But this resistance was far from easy. Workers could make their voices heard and asserted themselves by displaying manifestos in the workplace and writing to their press and party leaders. It was often the technicians and production bosses in the factory and workplace in general who felt intimidated. Hell yeah. Stalin also mentioned these conflicts when he dealt with the Stakhanovite movement, which began spontaneously, almost of its own accord from below, without any pressure of any kind from the administrators of our factories, and even in opposition to them. Yes, at least in the beginning, the Stakhanovites were forced to carry out their experiments in secret from the economic bodies, in secret from their controllers. A worker engaged in introducing innovations even risked dismissal, or was stopped by the intervention of the shop superintendent. In competition, and often in conflict with each other, we see a plurality of industrial authorities: technical, administrative, political, and trade unions. There is also distinction between the party and trade union at work. In conclusion, a visit to a Soviet factory or building site, even from the Stalin years, certainly did not leave an impression of entering a totalitarian workplace. Totalitarianism was far more developed in the factories of Tsarist Russia, where an unequivocal principle was in force. The factory owner is an absolute sovereign and legislator whom no laws constrain. Indeed, He could even have recourse to the whip in the case of infractions of certain importance. Or take a country like the USA. Let's bring into the picture the treatment reserved for prisoners, almost always African American, whose rental, as we know, was transferred between private companies. These companies could enjoy absolute control in exchange for wages. Quote, company guards were employed to chain prisoners, shoot those attempting to flee, torture any who wouldn't submit, and whip the disobedient, naked or clothed, almost without limit. Over 8 decades, from the 1870s until World War II, almost never were there penalties to any acquirer of these slaves for their mistreatment or deaths. Unquote. Sure, these were convicts, but keep in mind that for African Americans in the South, the charge of vagrancy alone was enough to be arrested, convicted, and sold as rental labor to entrepreneurs determined to enrich themselves. Other times, African Americans were simply captured by landowners and forced to provide forced labor. Not by chance, already in the title and subtitle of his book, the author quoted here spoke of slavery by another name, of the re-enslavement of black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. While even slaves or semi-slaves obviously constituted a small percentage of the overall labor force, it nonetheless gives one pause about the prolonged permanence of slave or semi-slave labor relations in the production sites of U.S. capitalist society. Beyond this, it is worth making a more general consideration. On closer inspection, in this Soviet factory, we see dynamics and relations at work that would be considered intolerably undisciplined, even in the capitalist factory of democratic countries. A well-known thesis of Marx, in The Poverty of Philosophy, may serve to clarify this point. Quote, while inside the modern workshop, the division of labor is meticulously regulated by the authority of the employer, modern society has no other rule, no other authority for the distribution of labor than free competition. It can even be laid down as a general rule that the less authority presides over the division of labor inside society, the more the division of labor develops inside the workshop, and the more it is subjected there to the authority of a single person. Thus, authority in the workshop and authority in society, in relation to the division of labor, are inverse ratio to each other. Unquote. It could be said that in Soviet society, there was at times a reversal of the dialectic of capitalist society described by Marx, the absence of rigid factory discipline, with the disappearance of the traditional, more or less accentuated despotism of the bosses, was matched by the terror exercised by the state over civil society. But even in this regard, one must be on guard against oversimplifications. We are in the presence of a more confused and less organized state than one might think. The center rarely spoke with a single voice. The same ideological uniformity was often only a facade. The usual analyses of totalitarianism are totally abstracted from the places of production and work, and for this reason, they are one-sided and superficial. If we put an end to this total and undue abstraction, the category of totalitarianism appears to us in all its inadequacy. It does not help us in any way to understand a society that, in its final phase, after the zealous faith, could not last forever, as Keenan had lucidly predicted, was undermined by a true and proper anarchy in the workplace, quietly deserted by the employees who, even when present, nevertheless seemed to be engaged in a sort of work-to-rule slowdown, which was tolerated. This is the impression that the workers and trade union delegations visiting the USSR in later years got, as we see reflected in Parenti's work, Black Shirts and Reds, that we read. Again, in this same playlist if you're reading from the live readings playlist, with a mixture of bemusement and slight approval. In a China that was beginning to leave Maoism behind, in the public sector, there were still customs that were described as follows by a Western journalist. Quote, even the last janitor, if he wants, can decide not to do anything at all, stay at home for 1 or 2 years, and continue to receive his salary at the end of the month. The culture of laziness continued to make itself felt even in the private sector of the economy that was emerging. Former state employees arrive late, then read the newspaper, go to the canteen half an hour earlier, leave the office an hour early, and often leave for family reasons, for example, because their wives are sick. And the managers and technicians who try to introduce discipline and efficiency in the workplace are forced to face not only resistance and moral indignation from employees, the fine imposed on a worker who took time off to look after his wife is a disgrace, but sometimes threats and even violence from below. It is very difficult to describe these relations according to the category of totalitarianism. One is best oriented by treasuring the passage already quoting from Marx. The poverty of philosophy can help us understand a phenomenon that is absolutely inexplicable from the point of view of classical theory of totalitarianism. In the USSR, in Eastern European countries, and in China, the more or less radical dismantling of the totalitarian system goes hand in hand with a drastic strengthening of discipline in the workplace. To give an example, only in 1993 was the law allowing dismissal for absenteeism passed in China. There is no doubt that, especially in situations of acute crisis, in the USSR and in Maoist China, the places of production and work were certainly not spared by terror. And yet, what characterized everyday life was a regime that was far from totalitarianism. In short, one could say that the usual recourse to this category is persuasive, only on the basis of a double, arbitrary abstraction. The removal from the field of investigation of the relations in force in the places of production and work makes it possible to juxtapose communist dictatorship and Nazi dictatorship. The silence on the terror and on the concentration-era universe enacted to the detriment of colonies and semi-colonies, as well as in the metropolis itself to the detriment of peoples of colonial origin, such as indigenous people and African Americans, makes it possible to dig a gulf between the liberal West and the totalitarian states. Compared to the Soviet Union of Brezhnev and his successors, Stalin dictatorship showed different characteristics. But the central element of differentiation was continued by the exceptional ideological and political mobilization, which, before deflating and losing any credibility, for a long period of time managed to provide an essential contribution to the functioning of the productive and economic apparatus. There were the decades in which a developmentalist dictatorship unfolded. It was both tumultuous and merciless, and it was characterized by the zealous faith of social and ethnic groups that saw the way cleared for a strong rise of living conditions, and that achieved a recognition that had been stubbornly denied them until then. It does not make much sense to assimilate this tragic and contradictory experience with a dictatorship, the Nazi dictatorship, which was explicitly established for the functions of war, colonial conquest, and the reaffirmation of racial hierarchies, and which, from the very beginning, could dispose of state and bureaucratic apparatus of consolidated efficiency, and could impose itself homogeneously in every sphere of social life. And, nevertheless, this assimilation has become something of a cliché. We need to investigate its genesis. And that is exactly what we will do next Thursday when we begin reading the next part of this book, Chapter 5, Erasure of History and the Construction of Mythology, Stalin and Hitler as Twin Monsters. So this will deal with the actual origin of the myth of Hitler and Stalin as being these twin monsters. We've now unpacked why the Gulag cannot be compared to the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And in fact, that those concentration camps in Nazi Germany can be better compared to things that we see in the West, as you all know. And that, in fact, they are inheritances of the same white colonial supremacist genocidal project. So come join me next week. Chapter 5. I will be uploading this, of course, to my YouTube. So those of you watching on YouTube, I've read this on Kick for everybody live. If you want to come join in the live readings and comment while I'm reading, then please feel free. Come see me on Kick. Larry is Leaping. You'll find me on Kick. You can find the link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, comrades. Join me next time for Leaping Larry's Reading Theater. Oh yes, I should mention, I've also bumped up the reading theater to an extra day, Mondays. As you might notice, we're now reading State and Revolution, which has been added as well to the live reads and its own playlist. Also, there's going to be another read added on Tuesdays, Juche reading. So from now on, we have Mondays, which is going to be reserved for Marxist theory, State and Revolution right now. Tuesdays for Juche work. Right now, live, we're reading 70 Years of Leadership, but then we're going to get to some theory. And Thursdays, we're going to focus on Iskra books. So Stalin History and Critique. And then when this is done, we'll do another Iskra book. So yes, thank you, YouTube, for joining me.